But what I just want to say is how incredible this experience has been, and how forward-thinking everybody has been in this project. And I just want to say, this is not obvious or easy work to do. As an artist who cares about cross-disciplinary thinking, it's not a given that scientists are going to feel that way with me, backwards, this way. And I really have devoted my life to challenging all disciplinary divides. I don't care what it is. I just instinctually want to challenge it, just because I'm always interested what is at stake with the people who keep the divide in place. I'm really curious as whatever the topic. But I just want you to all, if you don't, realize that your school is really pushing the boundary on how to do this work, because not only is it perhaps not obvious to do it, but then the mechanics of how do you do it requires infrastructure building, budgets, willing collaborators. The synthetic biology department has been so open and generous to me, and I can't thank them enough. And I'm saying that, I'm stressing it just because of a lifetime of doing such work. I don't assume I'm going to have a friendly collaborator on the other side. And it's a great question as to why, And so I hope what I'd like to show you today is to challenge these ways of thinking about any silo way of mentality, but also want to make the case great. Like on paper, that sounds great, but also just why? Why should you do it? And it's really important to me as an artist to make the case that there's an applicable reason to do it on both of our terms, not just metaphorically or symbolically, but how will the science move forward in a different way? How will my art move forward in a different way because of the collaboration on the terms of those disciplines? And I hope, in its most broad way of thinking, that you can make the case that solutions would appear that just would not have otherwise. So I have 3 examples to show you today. I don't know that I'll be able to get to them all. And I also apologize if some people have heard a little bit of this before, because I have talked about it, but I've included some new stuff too that I hope is interesting. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is committed to challenging the divide and to make the case as to why, especially with the problems that we have ahead. So I wanted to just recap where what's happening here right now. And I hope some people were able to come to this. If not, it is on the McCormick's website. But, one other point. Yes, I'm an artist, and it's the right word for what I do, but it's not the only word for what I do. And instead of the outcome being an object, which this is the expected thing that I would think one would expect when listening to an artist or a painting or a drawing, that's part of what I do, but that's only one aspect. So, for example, I have been here and with no expectation that I'm going to make something physical. The expectation is that I'm here as a thinker as much as a maker. And that one of those outcomes has been engaging with the synthetic biology department specifically about ethics and how the arts and humanities have a crucial role to play, especially in synthetic biology, but I'd say science more broadly. And again, the synthetic biologists can all agree to that as well, but then how do you do it? How do you implement it is what I'm really interested in. So we had this incredible presentation last year. Was it last year or this year? I can't. Yeah, it was spring. And I can't say enough good things about it. The way we designed the program was to tackle this. I'm concerned about it myself. The growing public suspicion about science, big science, all types of knowledge, and when these are the things that get the headlines, it tips the public in a certain way as far as suspicion or abuse of power, or the problem of you can but should you. This is a really important question, and the program was designed an evening of just artist science talking to each other in public, which is highly unusual. I don't know if you've ever seen that yourself, but I always want that to happen publicly. And 2, I really wanted to focus on the fact that all the good that is happening, the scientists who do grapple with ethical dilemmas, that it is part of their work. Those stories rarely actually make it to the headlines. And so everyone involved that night I invited, because not only are they brilliant in doing their specific research, but they're also highly socially conscious, ethically minded people who are trying to merge those concerns with the science. And I want to champion that as part of my work. So that was one of the outcome of my time here so far. Let's see. And I just put this up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but part of my time here is I want both practical and really big picture questions coming out of synthetic biology. And in each case, I want to argue why the arts and humanities have something to contribute to each of these things. All of these things in some way are big topics in the arts right now. And I would say synthetic biology is pushing all of them in various ways. So these are things that I'm going to continue to explore in my time here. And I wanted to say, I put this up because I wanted everyone to remember that, it's not a trivial thing, the relationship between art and science. Think of this example, the most famous one of all, of an artist grappling with the similar, provocative, scary to the general public developments occurring in science. And not only did Mary Shelley nail this so well, I mean, it's still the sort of archetype we use when we think about science run amok. So my point is that culturally, the conversation that directs many fields of science gets handed over to the arts whether you want it to or not. And so that to me is an argument in your future as young scientists. I hope I can plant a seed that, to think about working with an artist, whatever that may mean for you and your work down the road. But I don't know if it's ever been a consideration, but I want to make the case that you should. Just think about it. Even if it's the act of translation, the public face of what you're doing. Does it go this way or does it go another? And so it's not a small matter, because art does have a lot to say about cutting edge science over time. And I also spend a lot of time thinking about the history of art and science and why they split in the first place. And as I say, why we should argue that we should sort of get over that and circle back around. And I have a running list of, a lifetime list of what can we say we still have in common, or even back to our origins. And the one that I like to say is that at some level, both poet, artist, scientist, at some level, we're all trying to increase the sensitivity of our observations. And if you can do that as an artist, you're going to be pretty good. You can do that as a scientist, you're going to be pretty good. And I like to kind of twist this idea around of the way we sense, of an artist in charge of the Large Hadron Collider for a day. Or if Julius came to my studio and said, I think you should maybe refine that edge of that piece a little more. I like thinking about what's the most uncomfortable position we could put each other in. And generally that means we get into our studios or laboratories and actually open the door to collaborative thinking in that way. So I have a piece that I want to show you where I think I'm hopefully making that case. And then you may be familiar with this quote. I just love this quote by Richard Fineman. I think it gets to the heart of what things I'm after. And he was reflecting on this divide, and he said, "Poets say science takes away from the beauty of the stars, mere globs of gas atoms. I too can see the stars in a desert night and feel them. But do I see less or more? It does not do harm to the mystery to know a little bit about it. For far more marvelous is the truth than any artists of the past imagined it. Why do the poets of the present not speak of it?" And although I think I disagree with them that that poets aren't doing that, and artists. But I get the gist of what he's saying here, and I put it up because there's a really important thing to unpack that I've become sensitive to, which is we have a problem of misunderstanding or misinterpreting each other, and like I'm saying, maybe there's a general sense that science is run amok. There aren't ethical discussions internally occurring. On the other side, scientists can think artists, throw some paint on a canvas, and my child could do that. And there are these deep misunderstandings that we can be susceptible to when we think about each other. And I want to just crack that open and do a better job at that we're after something similar. A poet and a scientist looking up at the Milky Way at night. You can't really understand the Milky Way unless you have both of those opinions and perspectives on the table, in my opinion. And I just love that quote because he really gets to it. Final little text slide, but I point this out to another way of my own thinking about our divides and what we have in common, but between art and science. And I like to say that there's the what is question and there's the what matters question. And science is part of the what is. Art, poetry is the what matters, the construction of meaning merged with the data. And that's why they got separated. I know the dean has spent a lot of time talking about that historically, so I won't repeat all that, except to say that it wasn't always that way, and it doesn't continue to have to be that way on how we understand the world. And the things that I'm personally interested in as an artist, the topics that I tackle, all have to sort of meet this type of threshold where there is a development in science that I would argue is just so big that it transcends its field of origin, and you can't quite understand it unless you get other perspectives involved. And for me, that is, Lisa mentioned, I have this 10-year project on the history of the heart. I'm also working on the history of the imaging of the brain, and I'm very deeply interested in the search for life in the cosmos, either microbial or intelligent. And in all three cases, developments have occurred that are driven by science, but the implications of them being right or wrong, I would argue, transcend science, and you need other perspectives. So with that said, I hope I can show you 3 examples, depending on our time. But the first one is this body of work about the heart. I hope also, like you, I'm really big on asking questions. Part of my practice every day is writing questions. I don't know if I can answer them. It's not the point. The point is to ask these maybe slightly askew questions that sort of merge the poetic and the scientific, and then try to really go answer them in some way. So the 3 chapters will be kind of headed by a central question. So this one seems, maybe pretty simple, but it's quite complex, and I've taken it very serious in my work. And what I wanted to say about it is that, real quick, briefly, is that the mystery of the heart as both physiology, but as metaphor or spiritual, in a spiritual sense, historically, that's largely been the domain of art or religion, to think about how to image those mysteries. And the mystery of the heart is essentially another way of asking the history of where do you think you are in your body. And that's a fascinating philosophical question as it's kind of moved around the gut, the heart, the brain. We live a very craniocentric period about this topic. But the bulk of history, it was the heart. And I'm very curious as to why. What were the features about it that allowed for that? And my point here, though, is that it was generally up to science or religion to image it. Science, beyond autopsy, and that even only occurred much further down than from the earliest investigations of it by religion or art. Once autopsy was allowed, it was still a dead heart. It was not imaging the living heart. And this was a problem science largely could not figure out how to overcome. And And it's become this deep interest of mine of what is the history of imaging something you can't see, in this case, the heart. And by not seeing, not just the physiology, but other aspects of it that were perhaps mystical, religious, I mentioned. Whether you subscribe to that or not, as I'm saying, the bulk of history, the heart was not a metaphor. It was the literal vessel of the soul, a conduit between the immaterial and material realms. And that meant a lot to people. So we still carry the residual evidence everywhere, and I find this fascinating at the level of the history of metaphors. Why the metaphor of the heart just won't budge, no matter what science says. You know, we have heart-to-hearts, we wear our hearts on our sleeves, we give our hearts to each other, we don't give our kidneys in a metaphorical sense to each other. There's millennia of poetry about the heart, not the liver or lungs. And I'm curious as to why. So this story in particular has captivated me. I'm very interested in the history of heart transplantation, because that was a cultural moment where all science and the weight of history really collided in a profound way when we had the capability of literally giving each other's hearts to each other to continue living. And the press, I've done so much research on the press around this moment, not unlike some of the controversy in synthetic biology. Has science gone too far? The Frankenstein-ness of it. But something more deep about, but what did you actually give? Is this just a complicated pump, or did something else retain forward? And I've been fascinated with that topic. And where that's led me, and there's a reason I'm getting to this, I'll come full circle. This is that moment I'm arguing. Science is proposing something on the table that there was really no way to see it coming, but it's here, and it transcends only science. It's now into other topics, like I would argue philosophy and art, for example. Basically, we have not been able to solve this problem since the program began in the early 60s, of a total artificial heart, one that you can pull off the shelf, put it in a human, and let them live a meaningful, non-hospital-based life. And it has really stumped the field, because why is it so hard to replicate this? Which I find fascinating, that the heart is this complicated. But the big breakthrough that's come is, do we need to let go of a basic mechanism of the heart? Specifically, its pulsatility. And some doctors and heart surgeons and engineers that I've been working with for several years now, kind of monitoring, watching, but also giving my input, have proposed this new device. This has now been redesigned several times since this early model. But the basic premise, which it's kind of been out there for a while, it's called an LVAD. But these doctors want to use the basic Archimedes screw principle of the flow of blood in the body to bypass the need for pulsatility, which they hope will solve this problem of how do you make something do this 5 million times, let alone a billion, which is, we can't quite cross that threshold. So they're saying just remove it. And this is fascinating. And I find it, it's driven by a beautiful need to extend life and to save people's lives. And they tested it for the first time on a patient several years ago, Mr. Craig Lewis. This is the x-ray of it inside of him. And as incredible as it was, but here are the side effects of this device. The patient no longer has a pulse, they no longer have a heartbeat, and they no longer have an EKG. And Mr. Lewis was a flat line on every monitor in the room. And he lived for 5 weeks with this device. He actually even got a little better. All the sort of definitions of death and life in that room as information on those screens was totally upended. A flat line no longer just meant death in this moment. So what they did, again, it can be driven by incredible humanitarian needs, but it's a wasted opportunity if we don't contend and think about what does it mean to have a beatless heart. And, Dr. Fraser and others, in my discussions with them, would argue their dream down the road is you don't wait till people get sick. You put it in now, before they get sick. And again, could be a great idea, but I at least want to challenge the premise that we are totally fine as a society kind of scooting off the table a defining feature of what we are that no one thought was on the table to redefine, specifically that we have beating hearts. Not just physiologically, but all that other stuff, the metaphor, the way we relate to each other. There's a deep, rich history here to explore. So part of this project has been I'm really interested in sound history. And part of this project has been, can I build a sound archive of these devices as they're developing so that we have an idea to begin this discussion through sound, in the sense that, one of the most precious things we can give each other is listening to each other's hearts. And if he's right, and this is our future, we won't do that anymore, unless you go down this other road, which I'm going to show you, which is what it could sound like. So it took me time, but part of the project was to acquire the first recording of a beatless heart inside a human. And I'm going to play it for you now, and we'll talk about it afterwards. Well, let's see. So that is maybe our future, and maybe we're okay with that, but maybe we're not. And I at least want to challenge it and think about what it means to let go of pulsatility. As I've argued to him, no one's fallen in love with a beatless heart. Nobody's worshipped to their God with a beatless heart. No artist has ever tried to make art with a beatless heart, a drummer, a dancer, etc. And the scientist in you or the engineering in you may think that's maybe a trivial point, but I just want to argue to you that there's a cultural relevance to that I think it'd be a mistake to overlook, and at least that we should discuss it. So part of this project has been to document it as it goes, as sound, but also be tracing the history of the imagery. I mentioned that he was a flat line on all the monitors in the room, which got me deeply curious about the history of imaging the heart. Here are two milestones in image making that I don't think nearly get their due, even in art historical circles. But the first pulse wave, the premise of a pulse wave, just think about that. Something I'm sure everyone used or thinks about or don't even think about. But as a way of imaging an invisible action of a living human heart. As I mentioned, art and religion, millennia of beautiful images, very dramatic ones, even autopsy, once science got involved. You put all those images on the table, there's nothing that would indicate that would come next as far as imaging a heart. It's truly a jump in logic and visual image making. The other iconic image, the flat line, nobody had ever imaged death in this way before, even with that rich lineage of imaging death in art. And so, like with Mr. Lewis and the beatless heart, I'm trying to trace these milestone moments with the heart, but also have another motive, which is the people. And it worries me that, like Mr. Lewis, I'm talking to you about him today, but or Mr. Karp, the first transplant recipient. But history doesn't remember them at all. History remembers the heart surgeon. And, I'm not saying that we shouldn't, it's great. But these people, there's a long, 60-year history now of people who've literally given their lives to this technology, and nobody remembers them. But they each one volunteered in some way to test the next technology with the hope that it's going to save more down the road. And so part of my research has been, can I go back this far and remember who these people were? The first hearts who ever left a trace of their behavior behind, at least at this level of behavior as medical imaging. And an odd side effect of these devices, of these images, that is very current and something I think about a lot, is that these scientists were driven, like Dr. Fraser, through health, concern, humanitarian reasons. But they, there's an animation that was missing. But they also inadvertently created the abstraction of a human as a waveform, as data. And if anything, they could never have known the long-term consequences of that action as far as healthcare system today. You are your chart, and the kind of dehumanization of that need to distance the person whose heart is giving the information and then the data on the screen. And as I've traced the history, I just want to point out this beautiful thing. One of the early scientists who figured out how to do this, it's really touching. But he described his quest of imaging the pulse and the heartbeat as a way of potentially correcting the damage of Babel. And what he meant by that, as you may know the biblical story of Babel, the loss of a unifying tongue, the sort of origin story of all of our misunderstanding, because we no longer could communicate. But Murray, this French physiologist, talks about, could he literally arm your pulse with a pin of its own, get back and let it write out what it wants to say, and then it would be our job to decipher it. And he described this as this hieroglyphs of the heart. And that if we have any shot of correcting the damage of Babel, it would be that we all remember our hearts are saying the same thing, that they have a similar language. The challenge was, what does that mean? But he just wanted to get this far to image it. It's so beautiful. And so I bring it up to remind that its origin had this beautiful poetic and scientific reason. It's inadvertently turned into this other mass data of, abstraction of people. And my project, again, is tracing that they were driven by the study of disease. No one knew, did disease look different? Not only were they right, they invented cardiology in the process, have saved millions of lives since, as the technology gets better and better. And as the engineers in the room, I thought you'd like to see, I've just really made a deep dive into the early history of these devices. This is just a small handful. And they're so beautiful and strange. And again, they're all trying to do this thing. They're trying to image an invisible action in the body without the need to cut into someone. And the medium of the era, like that device there, or this cylinder, this is the invention of the concept of the polygraph, of multiple signals at once, the heart and the artery. But as an artist who just very insensitive to the history of materials, I have to tell you something really beautiful, which is no one could figure out how to trace such a tiny force, make it leave a mark, and on what medium. And the breakthrough came when a German scientist literally gathered soot from a candle flame on a piece of paper, which is why those are black. And he used his own hair, a single human hair, as a stylus, because it was the only thing he could find that was supple enough, but still had a bit of rigidity, so that not only would his pulse or heartbeat influence its movement through the compressed air through the tube, watch his own hair bounce in unison with his heart while it's being traced in soot-covered paper. It's just really beautiful. The edge of sensitivity. all trying to image the mystery of the heart. So I thought you might like that. So I'll show you a project, an actual sculpture here. I hope the history is interesting too, and that's as much part of my work as what I make. But this is a body of work where I'm trying to locate the very first times that a particular, in this case, the history of dreams and emotions, the very first time that new era of technology was applied to the next step. Not just disease, but what does the heart look like while someone's having a dream? You know, I was curious, well, did somebody do that? Some scientists must have been curious to do it. Or an emotional state. And the emotions are fascinating because science largely avoided studying emotions because the big problem was, well, how do you record it? How do you materialize it? How do you quantify it? And once they could figure out how to do this, they had a doorway to that. So there's this untapped body of tracings out there that I've been exploring because if anyone does know this history, it's all driven by the study of disease. But I've been looking for these outlier recordings that some scientists, maybe at the end of that research, which I find fascinating that it's sort of this sort of tacked on at the end, maybe out of just pure curiosity. But the first time, something as specific as religious guilt, and the story behind this is incredible, was recorded as a waveform. And you can clearly see something happens here. Anger, being scolded or shamed. And then these beautiful ones like somebody's ear lightly touched with a feather while they're sleeping. This is an actual study a scientist did. And here's that person's heart. They never could have known they would have left the remnant of that moment behind. But what I've done in this project is these are all. So I find the original waveform, do all the research, do everything I can to know this person. And in every one that I've chosen, there is such a beautiful story to tell about why did this happen, who was it, where did it happen, which obviously I won't go into all of them, but I only do this if I can guarantee that I can know something about them. Because as I'm saying, they left behind something they could never have predicted the future would really know in any meaningful way. These were often peasants. They were injured people in the hospital. They were just readily available people who had there was no such thing as consent yet on these things, and they were just tested. And so they have really beautiful lives to tell. And whereas history didn't remember them in other ways, strangely, they were remembered in the language of their heartbeat, mixed in with all these other studies of disease. So these are all, the original waveform is made into 3D. Then I may have made these bronze sculptures of each of their hearts. And so the idea is that these are they have weight to them. The idea was, can you hold religious guilt in your hand? From 1878, and so the person will interact with these by holding and actually kind of feeling and tracing out somebody's heart of the past. I'll just spend a moment telling you about this one because it's quite fascinating. And another, maybe the engineers in here will also find this fascinating. But once the heart technology was somewhat perfected. This Italian scientist, Angelo Mosso, was the first to take it to the brain. He's not widely remembered, but he literally invented the concept of real-time brain imaging, which think of how that's changed the world. And he essentially took the same idea of pulsations, compressed air, hair, and soot from a candle flame, and went out on a quest finding very rare people who somehow survived a massive skull injury, and their brain was somewhat exposed, and they actually lived. And he had this beautiful idea called the cerebral pulse, which essentially was the heartbeat of the brain. And he was the first scientist to ask something we still don't have a good answer to, which was there a corresponding blood flow to distinct mental states? And in other words, he wanted to prove the materiality of consciousness. And in 1877, with hair, soot, and pulsatility, it's just amazing to me that he even got somewhere. Anyway, Angelo, this peasant, Bertino, this construction worker, was working one day near his local church, and a brick fell from high above, hit him in the skull, left a big. They had to remove the skull to save him. Nobody expected him to live. He actually survived, and Maso has these beautiful letters and notes about him, and I've read all of them and trying to paint a picture of him because he's only ever. This is kind of who he is. The history of it remembers that. But I just want to tell you that this man right here, his brain proved that distinct mental states have a corresponding blood flow to them. He was the one that did that. And I mean, the scientists did, of course, too. But I just want us to think about that, too. No, otherwise, he's not remembered. And by complete coincidence, Maso was setting up an experiment in his laboratory. And he has Bertino looking straight ahead at a white wall. And because he's learned from previous experiments that this is a time no one even knows what they're looking for. It doesn't know what the signal should look like as far as a mental state and a corresponding blood flow. So he's removed all visual influence on Bertino. He's staring ahead at a white wall. And Maso thinks he's done a great job sort of containing him in a space. He hooks up the device. Off screen here, Maso is turning a soot-covered cylinder with his hand that's making the cylinder turn. And the idea was that he was going to have Bertino solve mathematical problems. He's also the one who got his ear rubbed with a feather. He did all these studies on sleep. But something crazy happened that nobody could have predicted and which has left us with that, which is what I'm taking the deep dive on. By complete coincidence, the local church bells rang. Bertino's a very religious man, but he had been scolded many times, do not move under any circumstance, because the device is so sensitive. So suddenly, his brainwave, as pulsatility, goes crazy on this chart. But the experiment had not officially started. And so Maso stops. He's annoyed because he thinks for sure Bertino has moved or something. And then Maso had this brainstorm and kept the device running and specifically wondered if he had heard the church bells. And he asked him, did you hear the church bells? And he's sitting there with completely motionless. His brain waves start going crazy. And he says, yes. And then he asked him, did you feel guilty for not reciting your midday prayers? And he says, yes. And that is what happened when he said this. And, there's a long way to go here as far as that is religious skill. I don't think I'm saying that. But it's the beginning of a premise that you could record such things. There was some material basis to them. But it also puts forward a very provocative idea we're still dealing with today, which is that science could know something about you without you outwardly expressing that. This is essentially the invention of the lie detector and the whole premise that there's other truth to be known by this other data set coming out of you, which has led to all kinds of interesting, some very problematic things. But anyway, this is where it starts. And each one of the boxes filled with the first time such dreams and emotions were ever documented. And there it is again. So the way it's displayed, it's hard to sort of convey the full effect here. But it's in a room, it's spotlit. All those waveforms are they're glowing. They're like producing glows on the ceiling even. There's a sound piece that accompanies the work and a video that I won't go over here. But it's really meant to let a viewer walk in and almost see if they could be in that space again, that experiment. So as I often do, I put too much work in than I can get to. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. And do we want questions? So counting the 10 minutes?
Thereabouts, yes.
What?
Thereabouts, yes. So about 10 minutes total.
Total. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll pause there because I'd love to have some questions. And I'll just quickly wrap up. I only got to one of my examples, but the point is that I could never have made this work without this deep dive into science, working with those heart surgeons, sort of learning the history of how you image the heart, but also this divide between the person themselves and the data. And that is something that, through collaboration, that I hope the artist-science collaboration can give voice to in a different way. And Dr. Fraser, to his deep credit, has really taken these to heart, so to speak, and is listening. And how that device that Beatless Heart gets designed moving forward. The big question on the table is, but does it have to be beatless? Can it not merge two needs here? Can it use this continuous flow? But can it not address, if long-term health is the quest, and psychological, emotional health long-term is also a health problem, is there a way to merge both of those needs back together? So that's where I'm hoping to go with that project in our conversations. So I'll wrap up there, and hope we have a few questions. Please, if you disagree, I really like that. So please challenge.
So, is there anything in modern science that, like, modern science is revealing in the same way, that's like giving us some sort of, deeper explanation for something that would define what it means to be human? Like, what in your mind is happening right now?
Well, I'm very interested in artificial intelligence and for obvious reasons, but I'm more specifically interested in that as it relates to art. And I've been doing work on that because I really bristle when I hear that AI has made art, which is getting more and more popular to say. And if somebody's working on that and has done that, please say you disagree or not. But I find that not a trivial thing, because there's one of my examples I didn't get to is a blossoming field called neuroaesthetics. And it's basically defined as, the brain imaging technology is getting to a state where, not unlike what Maso did, you can get more and more specific about a specific blood flow state on a given experience. And art has largely not been studied, or aesthetic experience has largely not been studied as far as brain imaging for really interesting, complex reasons that I won't go over so much, except to say it's very complicated, and it's hard to know where to go from there. And I'll just show you an image as I'm talking about it. Sorry, this is about the search for life in the cosmos, and then this work I'm doing here. Let's see, where is it? Oh, this image just really cracks me up. But most studies of aesthetics have been hinging on the fMRI machine, and which have required studies like this of a jazz pianist improvising in an fMRI machine. Everyone admits, are we studying aesthetics here? Like, what is this art in the sense that my standards of art would be? And I find that so fascinating. The problem is the imaging part. It's hard to get away from the fMRI. But the EEG technology is getting better and better. And so I'm fascinated with this field, and I've been doing a project about it where I hope I'm answering your question, because this is an example of where I think science can make a mistake in its claims, and which is really causing a lot of tension in the humanities on this topic, neuroaesthetics, because there's a claim that if we can get that incredibly detailed blood flow map, that we have explained art. And I think scientists stumble sometimes in that language as far as what explaining means. And you get to something like art or an aesthetic experience, and nobody in the arts or humanities wants to hear a scientist say, hey, guess what? I figured out what art is because I can map the blood in your brain. And while that is an important layer to the experience, and I want to know all that I can, it's not, it's missing something, And so to me, this topic's a great one of why we should collaborate, art and science, on this point. But I think it's important because, even though things get chipped off as far as what makes us different from other animals, that's a harder and harder case to make about what's just ours. Art making for a long time has been really high on that list. You can make arguments with bowerbirds, for example, about that. But aesthetic experience of the type we've refined does seem pretty unique to us, and we can debate that or not. So the material explanation for that, for me at least, that sort of that biggest one of all, that biggest variable of what separates us somehow from animals, is fascinating. Not only in that can we materially explain it, but also the provocation of it. That because a lot of art and art history doesn't always want to accept that there's something mystical sort of outside the domain of science that may still partly explain that. I don't accept that like some of my other fellow artists do. I think there is a material explanation, and I think it's going to be fascinating, and it will partly help us explain art. But it's not going to, that divide between the meaning and my question early on, that divide still has to be worked on. And I find AI, the developments of it with art and the claims of it making art, so much so that maybe some of you saw the story this year, but the first AI-generated art sold at an auction at like $100,000, which in the art world, this is one sign of that it's good, and I have real problems with that. But it's true. It's whether I like it or not, it's true. But that it went through all those steps of conceptualizing, scientists went through to make it. It got put into an art value system, which was justified but through an auction price. All those steps, I think, is missing so many important things about the definition of art. I'm totally open constantly to be challenged on any definition. So I have no problem letting go of what I think or thought art was if AI is going to get involved. But I think it'd be important to say that you have to expand your definition of what art and aesthetics are if you're going to make the claim that AI is making it too. I don't know all the details of that, but I think it's a provocative one because it will be poking at some basic, like with the Beatless Heart, it's poking at another definition of humanity that no one really thought was on the table to be tinkering with. So I think for myself, that's where something really interesting is happening in that field. Yeah. So, okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Yeah.